Hey guys, my name is Tom, and welcome to part 9 of my networking tutorial series. If you haven't seen the previous parts, make sure to go watch those first, and then come back to this one. Today we'll be making items spawn at various points on the map, and we'll allow players to pick up those items. At the end of the last tutorial, I mentioned that I wanted to cover projectiles, area damage, and picking up objects all in one video, but I'm a little short on time as I'm recording and editing this entire tutorial the day before I leave on a 2-week-long trip, so I decided not to cover all those topics at once. As usual, you'll find links to the Discord server and the code on GitHub in the description, so check those out if you get stuck or have questions. Before we get started though, I just wanted to point out that the core of the networking solution has been complete since part 5 of this series, and all the tutorials since then are just examples of how to implement various mechanics and functionality. There's tons of different ways of setting up these features, and my way is by no means the best or most efficient way for your game. My hope is that by providing these extra examples, it will help you guys to really understand the pattern of how to set up multiplayer mechanics, so that eventually you're no longer dependent on my videos to add the things you want to add to your projects. With that out of the way, let's jump right in. Since the last tutorial, I expanded our scene so we have a bit more room to play around in, and I added some color to make it easier to tell what's going on. You can of course set up your scene any way you like, just make sure that the client's graphics match the server's colliders. First of all, we're going to add an empty game object to our scene, which will be our item spawner. Add a box collider and check the isTrigger checkbox. Then add a new script called item spawner. Attach this new script to the item spawner game object and then open it up. Inside, we'll start by adding a static spawners dictionary. We'll use this to keep track of all item spawners in the scene by ID. Add a static int to store the ID of the next spawner to be created. Now add an int for the spawner ID and a boolean to store whether or not the spawner currently has an item. Create a start method inside which we'll set hasItem to false, set the spawner ID to the next spawner ID, and then increase next spawner ID's value. This will ensure that each spawner in our scene has a different ID. Finally, add this instance of the item spawner class to the spawners dictionary. Below, we'll create a coroutine called spawnItem, which will spawn an item after 10 seconds of being called. Back in the start method, start the coroutine. Next, add a method to handle situations when an item is picked up. Inside, we'll set hasItem to false and then start the spawnItem coroutine again. Below the start method, add an onTriggerEnter method. We'll use this to check if the collider that entered our item spawner's trigger is tagged as a player, and if it is and the player can pick up the item, we'll call the itemPickedUp method. We've got an error right now because the player class doesn't have an attempt_pickup_item method. Open up the player class and add 2 fields, one for the player's current number of items and one for the player's maximum amount of items. At the bottom, create the attempt_pickup method and use it to return true or false depending on whether or not the player already has the maximum amount of items. In the packet class, add a createItemSpawner element to the server packets enum. In the serverSend class, add a method to create this packet. We'll use it to let clients know where each item spawner is, what its ID is, and whether or not it currently has an item. Now in the client project, create a new script, also called itemSpawner. Then open up the packet class and add the same createItemSpawner element to the server packets enum. In the clientHandle class, add a method to handle this packet. Whenever we receive one of these packets, we'll want to add an item spawner to the world, so let's add the necessary code to allow us to do that. In the item spawner class, add 4 fields for the spawner ID, whether or not the spawner has an item, a reference to the spawner's mesh renderer, and a vector 3 to store the base position, which we'll be using later. Next, add an initialize method inside which we'll initialize all the fields we just created. Now open up the Game Manager class and add a dictionary to store the item spawners by their ID, just like on the server. We'll also need a reference to the item spawner prefab. At the bottom, add a method to create our item spawner. Inside, instantiate a clone of the prefab, and then call the attached item spawner class's initialize method. Finally, add the new item spawner instance to our spawners dictionary. Back in the clientHandle class, we can now call the Game Manager's createItemSpawner method when we receive a packet telling us to do so. And of course, don't forget to add the packet ID and its corresponding packet handler method to the packet handler's dictionary in the client class's initializeClientData method. Now in the server project, I'm going to duplicate the item spawner and position them where I want them on the map. In the client project, we still need to create our item spawner prefab, so create a cube, rename it, remove the box collider, and attach the item spawner script. I'm also going to resize it, rotate it a bit, and change its color to make it look more interesting. Finally, drag the item spawner into the prefabs folder, delete it from the scene hierarchy, and then drag the prefab into the game manager's item spawner prefab slot. Next, open up the server's client class and find the send into game method. At the end, add a for each loop and use it to send new clients a create item spawner packet for each item spawner that exists. If you connect to the server now, you should see that as many item spawners as you placed on the server are spawned on the client. However, even though we have the pickup functionality in place, nothing currently happens if you run through the item spawner's collider, at least not on the client side. That's because we're not letting clients know when an object is spawned or picked up, so let's do that next. In the server's packet class, add an item spawned element to the server packets enum. Next, in the server send class, create an item spawned method. Inside, we'll just write the ID of the spawner that spawned an item, and then send the packet through TCP. Then in the item spawner's spawn item method, send the packet we just created. Now on the client side, we'll add the same item spawned element to the server packets enum. Open up the client handle class and create a method to handle our item spawn packet, inside which we'll just read out the spawner ID for now. Next, we need to add an item spawned method to our item spawner class. Inside, simply set hasItem to true and enable the mesh renderer. Now in our newly created packet handler method, we can call the item spawner's item spawned method. Finally, don't forget to add the packet ID and its associated packet handler method to the client class's packet handlers dictionary. If you test this now, you should see that once the item spawner spawns an item on the server, the model will become visible on the client side. We still need to let clients know when an object is actually picked up, so open up the server's packet class and add an item picked up element to the server packets enum. Then open the server send class and add an item picked up method. I decided to simply copy and paste the item spawn method since it's pretty similar. However, make sure to change the packet ID and to write the ID of the player who picked up the item to the packet. Back in the item spawner class, we can now send this packet from the item picked up method. Next, in the client handle class, we need to handle the incoming packet, so create a method to read out its contents. Then open the item spawner class and create a method called item picked up and make it do the opposite of the item spawned method. Finally, we'll keep track of how many items each player has collected, so add a field for this in the player manager class. When we receive an item picked up packet, we'll simply increment this value. We haven't added the item picked up element to the server packets enum on the client side, so do that, and then don't forget to add the packet ID and its corresponding packet handler method to the packet handlers dictionary. You should see that if we run this now and connect to the server, walking through an item will cause it to disappear, and the player's item count value increases. The last thing I want to do is to make our items look a little more interesting. This is going to be purely visual, so the server won't play any role in it. In the client-side item spawner class, add two floats, one for the item's rotation speed and one for its bob speed. Then in an update method, if the spawner has an item, we'll rotate it around the vertical axis in world space and add an offset to its position using the sign function, which is why we stored the base position earlier. Connect to the server now, and you'll see the items spinning and bobbing up and down, sort of the way they do in Minecraft. Anyways, I'll leave it there for this tutorial. If you found it helpful, make sure to smash the like button, and leave any feedback you've got in the comments below. In the next one, we'll make it possible for players to throw these items like grenades. If you don't want to miss that, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell so you're always notified when I upload another video. With that said, thank you so much for watching, I really appreciate it, and I'll see you again next time.